This is the Economic Club of Florida, a distinguished platform for discussion of the major national issues of the day. On today's program, retired Army General and former CIA Director David Petraeus on evaluating geopolitical risks to investments.
I believe we face the greatest number and most complex array of challenges since probably the end of World War II, certainly since the end of the Cold War.
Good day and welcome to the 566th in our series of distinguished speaker programs. I'm Harvey Bennett for the Economic Club of Florida. We are very honored and privileged to have with us today former U.S. Army General and former CIA Director David Petraeus. He retired as a four-star general after a distinguished 37-year military career and then served as CIA Director under President Obama. Today, General Petraeus is a partner at the New York-based global investment firm of KKR and Chairman of the KKR Global Institute, which he established in 2013. General, welcome, sir.
Great to be with you. Thanks, and wonderful to be at Florida State with Seminole Nation.
That's right. What will you be sharing with the club today, General?
Well, a number of observations, insights. First is that I believe we face the greatest number and most complex array of challenges since probably the end of World War II, certainly since the end of the Cold War, and that what we do in the KKR Global Institute, which is to identify geopolitical risks during the process of examining potential investments and then how to mitigate them, has become increasingly important over the 10 years that I've been with KKR. During that time, the world has truly transformed from an era of benign globalization, in which economics largely determined geopolitics, to an era of renewed great power rivalries in which geopolitics very much constrains investment, trade, economics, and a variety of other interactions. The rise of China, the continued rise of China, the resurgence of a very aggressive Russia, obviously having invaded Ukraine without provocation in a particularly brutal manner, the continued challenge posed by North Korea, that posed by Iran, a number of cyber threats that exist, and a host of other challenges, all, again, make this time very, very challenging for the United States and for our allies around the world.
General, we're looking forward to your presentation very much. Thank you, sir.
Again, great to be with you.
Now, here's John Bradley, Senior Investment Officer for the Florida State Board of Administration, with our formal introduction.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator and guest speaker for today's event. I'll begin with today's moderator. Ash Williams is Vice Chair, J.P. Morgan Asset Management. With assets under management of $2.7 trillion, the firm is a global leader in investment management. Prior to joining J.P. Morgan Asset Management, Mr. Williams was Executive Director and Chief Investment Officer of the Florida State Board of Administration with assets over $250 billion. Previously, he was a Managing Director at Fir Tree Partners and President and CEO of Schroeder Capital Management. Earlier in his career, he held senior roles in the executive and legislative branches of Florida's state government, including initial leadership of the SBA from 1991 to 1996. Ash is a trustee of the Florida State University Foundation and the National Institute for Public Finance. He serves on the investment committees of the IEEE and the Episcopal Diocese of Florida. Ash serves on the board of the Economic Club of Florida, is a Hall Fellow of the Pacific Pension and Investment Institute, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Ash received his Bachelor of Science and MBA degrees from the Florida State University and lives in Tallahassee with his wife, Jan. So now on to today's speaker, General David Petraeus. General Petraeus is a partner in the global investment firm KKR and chairman of the KKR Global Institute, which he established in mid-2013. He is chairman of the International Advisory Board for Advanced Navigation, a personal venture investor engaged in various academic endeavors, and co-author with Andrew Roberts of the forthcoming book titled Conflict, The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. Prior to joining KKR, General Petraeus served over 37 years in the U.S. military, culminating his career with 6 consecutive commands as a general officer, 5 of which were in combat. including command of the surge in Iraq, command of U.S. Central Command, and command of coalition forces in Afghanistan. Following retirement from the military and after confirmation by the Senate in a vote of 94-0, he served as the director of the CIA during a period of significant achievements in the War on Terror. General Petraeus graduated with distinction from the U.S. Military Academy and later earned a PhD from Princeton University. He is the only individual to have been the top graduate of both the year-long Command and General Staff College course and the demanding U.S. Army Ranger School. He has held academic appointments with the U.S. Military Academy, the University of Southern California, Harvard, Georgetown, and the City University of New York Honors College. And he is currently a senior fellow and lecturer at Yale, an honorary professor at the University of Birmingham, a member of both the Trilateral Commission and the Aspen Strategy Group, co-chairman of the Global Advisory Council of the Woodrow Wilson Center, senior vice president of the Royal United Services Institute, and an executive advisory board member of World Minds. General Petraeus has earned numerous awards and decorations, including 4 Defense Distinguished Service Medals, the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award, the Bronze Star Medal for Valor, 2 NATO Meritorious Service Medals, the Combat Action Badge, Master Parachutist Wings, and the Ranger Tab. He has also been decorated by 14 foreign countries and sanctioned by Russia, and he is believed to be the only person who, while in uniform, threw out the first pitch of a baseball World Series game and did the coin toss at a Super Bowl. So, General Petraeus, we are honored to have you with us today, and I will now turn it over to Ash. And you. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and welcome, General. We are deeply and truly honored to have you with us today. We are grateful for you taking the time and are grateful for your service to this great country. And after hearing that very distinguished resume, I can only say it is very timely that you now get a ticket punch at Florida State University. Congratulations.
Thank you. I should thank John. He left something out also, which is that I was runner-up for Time Person of the Year to Vladimir Putin. So this whole Ukraine adventure that he's undertaken is very personal, but thanks. It is really a privilege to be with the ECF. It's great to be at the home of Seminole Nation. I was asking how it worked out against LSU last year. Apparently it went very, very well. And I wish you the best for your opener against LSU this year, which I gather will be in Orlando, not here. Good luck.
Thank you. So it's been 10 years since you joined Colbert, Kravis, and Roberts. Hard to believe, but it's been a full decade and a productive one, as far as I know, between you and the firm.
Yeah, we've gone from $63 billion to $500 billion. It's been a pretty good period.
It's not a bad run, and as I remember, the fees at KKR are better than the ones at the Florida pension system, so that's great.
A little better than the U.S. military, too.
How has your role evolved over that decade?
Well, it's evolved significantly because the world has evolved significantly. When I joined KKR, you would describe the world at that time as one of benign globalization. Barriers to trade, investment, capital flows were all going down. Global trade was going way up. Economics largely determined geopolitics, and the geopolitical risks that we were examining were really when we were doing investments in countries for the first time, certainly not when we were investing in the United States, Western Europe, the developed economies of the Pacific Rim. But it was very central to the first time we invested in Mexico, former Yugoslavia, Philippines, Vietnam, Colombia, Chile, and so forth. But again, not the major developed economies. 10 years later, we are in a world of renewed great power rivalries in which geopolitics increasingly constrains, creates the context within which investment, trade, and economics take place. Globalization, instead of going like this in terms of global trade, has become slowbalization. It's just barely going up at this point in time. And the barriers, again, to trade, investment, and economics have been increasing rather than continuing the decrease. The continued rise of China, its more assertive, more aggressive actions, not just in the Indo-Pacific region, but literally around the world, are causing enormous changes in how it is that we invest because, of course, everyone invests with China. Russia's unprovoked and brutal invasion of Ukraine has carried with it additional risks. And there's a variety of other challenges around the world. In fact, I would contend that we currently face the most numerous and challenging array of threats that we have had arguably since the end of World War II, not just the end of the Cold War. Not more dangerous, perhaps, than certain periods of the Cold War, but much more complex. And if you think of the United States as the guy in the circus who keeps a whole bunch of plates spinning simultaneously, we have allies and partners that help us with a number of those plates. But at the end of the day, it's in our interest to keep those plates going. The plate that represents the U.S. and Western relationship with China is bigger than all the others put together. We can't even let it wobble, and we can talk more about that. But again, many other plates, in addition to Russia, North Korea, Iran, a number still of Islamist extremist groups that still wish us ill and on whom we have to keep an eye and pressure, because if we don't, they can reconstitute and create problems, as was the case with the Islamic State in Iraq after we left. And then a variety of other challenges are out there, cyber threats of all different manner, and even domestic populism in some cases. All of these cause various elements of geopolitical risk that can affect the success of a potential investment. And that's what we do, is we identify those risks, we determine whether we can mitigate them sufficiently, we integrate the macroeconomic analysis and the environmental social governance issues analysis as we go to the investment committee. And again, this has become much more central to the investment, to the diligence process than it was even just 10 years ago. It's wonderfully intellectually stimulating. To be candid, when I left government, what I really wanted was something that would be intellectually stimulating, would be rewarding, in some degrees even gratifying, if you will, what have you, and help us pay the rent. And this has more than achieved all of those.
That's an artful summary of the way things have evolved, and anybody who's ever invested anything knows there are two pieces to investment. One is protecting capital, and the other is compounding it. And to the extent you haven't been able to protect it, guess what? It's not there to compound. And one of the issues that we're looking at most fundamentally with this reversal of globalization is that we have players who are willing to go outside the normal rules of engagement, not just on a global boundary standpoint or a military standpoint, but on commercial grounds as well. Hence, we have the stresses with China, et cetera. So the poster child of the day for this reversal in globalization arguably is the war in Ukraine. And it might be useful to just look at first principles for a minute before we get into where things stand right now and ask the question, why did Vladimir Putin feel the need to do this? Obviously, it started way back in 2014, but we've seen a lot in the past year.
Well, it started back even before that. If you recall, back in the previous century, he was asked, what was the most terrible moment in this century, and he, overlooking World War I, World War II, and the Great Depression, identified the day that the Soviet Union dissolved. And that colors his entire perception. He also has a very grievance-filled view of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, especially of Ukraine. He doesn't believe that Ukraine has a right to exist as a sovereign country. He believes it should be part of the Russian Federation. He's really tried to reassemble as much of the Soviet Union, or say the Russian Empire, as he possibly could. And because Russia is one of the top 3 natural gas, crude oil, and coal producers in the world, and the world still does need all of that, not to mention agricultural goods, minerals, particularly strategic minerals and so forth, he's had pretty full coffers to use to pursue his various ambitions. They haven't materialized all that much, other than perhaps this partnership with Belarus, which he's propped up in the face of enormous demonstrations, and a couple of other sort of satellite countries, nothing akin to NATO, to put it mildly. But he ultimately kept talking about Ukraine, and he set his sights on it. Of course, in 2014, they occupied the Crimea Peninsula. and also part of the southeastern part of the country called the Donbass, the Donetsk and Luhansk provinces, supported separatists there, and then, of course, last February launched the invasion, which has gone terribly for him. The idea was to take Kyiv, topple the government, replace President Zelensky with a pro-Russian figure. That obviously did not turn out well. In fact, they lost the Battle of Kyiv. They ultimately had to withdraw from it. The Ukrainians have been phenomenal. By the way, I've gone to Ukraine many, many times over the years, all the way back to when it was still part of the Soviet Union, and I was the aide to the Chief of Staff of the Army, and we were making the first visit to the Soviet Union since General George C. Marshall went to Yalta in the final months of World War II, so it was quite historic. And then went again not long after, actually, in fact, with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, when it was independent, following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and then many times since then. But I watched in particular over the last decade or so as its military got better and better and better. And that was particularly true after the invasion of 2014. And Putin and his intelligence services clearly completely underestimated the quality of the Ukrainians and the fierceness of their resistance. This is their war of independence, and they're fighting it that way. They completely underestimated how President Zelensky would perform as a wartime president. And to be fair, his first 2.5 years in office had not been particularly distinguished, but he has been positively Churchillian since the Russians invaded. Again, Putin thought he was launching a, quote, special operation. I'm sure that's what he told President Xi. You may recall that he was in Beijing on the eve of the Olympic opening ceremonies, again, well over a year ago. We believe he told President Xi at that time, by the way, thanks for announcing this partnership without limits. There is going to be this little special operation. It won't take long, maybe a week or so. We'll topple the government, replace it, and then we'll be home to a victory parade in Moscow. And needless to say, it has not turned out that way.
So, to your point about Mr. Zelensky, I can't help but note that his background before assuming his role was that he was an actor and a stand-up comedian.
He played the president, actually, and he did it so well in a comedy on TV that it led to him being elected president. So, a little bit like Ronald Reagan, perhaps, and all of a sudden has become the great communicator. As I noted, he was elected to carry out reforms of the judiciary, all the usual ills, frankly, of a still developing country. There's corruption, they have oligarchs. What's their role? They need land reform. Again, they need judicial reform. In particular, rule of law is always weak and certainly lacks integrity, shall we say. And he'd had very modest achievements prior to the invasion. Since then, again, he has been truly Churchillian. This is the part of a lifetime, and he is performing brilliantly in it.
Would agree. So on to that point, how would you assess where we are today on the battlefield?
I hope that we are approaching a pivotal moment. What has happened, of course, during the first year, the Russians came at Kyiv from the north and also from the east. Both of those failed, and they literally had to withdraw their forces. They came at Sumy and Chernihiv, two other northeastern cities. They've withdrawn as well. They seriously threatened Kharkiv, the second largest city in the east, right up near the border. It was a Russian-speaking area, and it had some sympathy for Russia until, of course, Putin launched this. The irony is that no one has done more for the cause of Ukrainian nationalism than Vladimir Putin. The other irony is that Putin set out to make Russia great again, and what he has really done is make NATO great again. The greatest gift to NATO since the end of the Cold War is Vladimir Putin. And here you have an action that forces the two neutral countries on his border, Sweden and Finland, Finland with a very long border with Russia, to actually ask to join NATO after decades of being neutral, and really historically neutral. So he's done an incredible amount of damage to Russia. But they came at Kharkiv. They had to withdraw from there as well, got beaten back. And then they lost the area south of Kharkiv in the offensive that the Ukrainians carried out last year. But they do control the southeastern part that folds down into Crimea. So for the first time, they can reinforce Crimea, going directly from Russia along the southeastern coast down into Crimea, which is also joined by a bridge to the Russian mainland. This summer, I hope that the Ukrainians, who have withstood this winter offensive that the Russians have been throwing at them, and just waves of humanity, frankly, a lot of them, by the way, convicts who were allowed to be freed if they would go to the front lines. And the Russians have taken incredible losses. Again, the numbers vary, but at least 5 and maybe as much as 8 times the losses in a single year that they took in 10 years in Afghanistan, a war that was obviously ultimately unsustainable and to a degree led to the undoing of the Soviet Union. The Ukrainians have largely held them off. They've given up very grudgingly modest amounts of territory. And right now, the Ukrainians are training entire new brigades, that's say 3,000 to 4,000 soldiers in each one, armored and mechanized, artillery, engineer battalions, all of the elements that will be necessary to achieve what's called combined arms operations and effects. The Russians have not been able to do this, and the Ukrainians in their offensive did okay, but not brilliantly at that. What I mean here is you don't just send tanks at the enemy, you send tanks who are supported by infantry. And actually there's some military folks in here who know what I'm talking about, including a couple who were on the Central Command staff with me. You have artillery that is suppressing the enemy and mortars. You have air defense keeping the enemy's air off of you. You have your area over your shoulders if you can. You have electronic warfare to jam the enemy's command and control and communication systems. You have engineers and explosive ordnance disposal to eliminate obstacles and defuse mines and so forth. And you crack the front of the enemy. This is fearsome stuff. We achieved this during the fight to Baghdad. And once we got this going, I was a 2-star then commanding the Great 101st Airborne Division, but we had tanks and infantry fighting vehicles attached to us. It's pretty fearsome. And I think that the Ukrainians are going to do that in the offensive that we anticipate will be launched probably in May or June. These brigades are being trained right now in Germany at our training centers in Grafenbier and Hohenfels, in eastern Poland, in the UK, and also in Ukraine itself. And the other thing that they'll have this time that will be different is they'll have logistics right up behind them. That's more ammunition, food, fuel, water, medical support, and so forth. And they'll have reserve units so that when they make progress and you then culminate after about 72 hours, the body just can't keep going any longer. We proved that actually during the fight to Baghdad. I proved it to myself as well. Then there'll be forces that can punch through and exploit the progress that they have made and keep it going, and you just keep doing that. And I'm hopeful that they'll be able to cut this ground line of communication that reinforces, that allows the Russians to connect with Crimea, and then put Crimea at risk, the airfields and the logistical bases that they're using to support up into southern Ukraine, and that can make a difference. The problem is that there is still tough fighting. Vladimir Putin, I think, is still convinced that the Russians can outsuffer the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the Americans the way that Russians historically outsuffered Napoleon's army, outsuffered Hitler's Nazis, and so forth. And we need to help the Ukrainians together with our NATO and other Western allies and partners to prove them wrong.
So on that point of the outsuffering, the siege of Leningrad comes to mind, and a number of other precedents that you referred to. Obviously, the Ukrainians have the will, they have the motivation, they have the savvy, they have the wiliness, and the management acumen to get this done. Do they have enough bodies relative to Russia, to your point about waves of Russians coming?
Yep. Okay. Yeah, they're still generating additional forces. Keep in mind their population is about 40,000. Russia's about a little under 140,000. Actually, Ukrainians are less than 40,000 now because millions of women and children have left. But the men have all stayed. And again, this is their war of independence, and Ukraine has fully, completely mobilized. Everybody is committed to this. The business people are engaged in it, the IT experts, it's a real source of great IT skills. They're all engaged in this, and the innovativeness, the entrepreneurship that they're employing is really extraordinary. They take these little do-it-yourself drones and they hang a Russian munition from underneath it, and they're literally dropping them into the hatch of a turret of a tank. And the Russian tanks still have this unbelievable flaw decades after it was first identified, where the ammunition is not sequestered from inside the turret. And so what happens is eventually it catches on fire and it blows the turret off. This is why you see those turrets on the side of a tank. And the tank crews learn pretty early on that it's not a good idea to stay with the tank if there's something burning inside it. So they immediately go out the top, and that leads to incredible tank losses. The Russians have lost over half of the tanks that they had when they started the war. It's just staggering numbers. It's more tanks than the entire rest of NATO has without the United States. And they cannot replace them. Their military-industrial complex lacks. We have export controls on them. And by the way, that's the other thing we need to do, is not just continue to provide additional arms, ammunition, and other material assistance, but also to tighten the economic, financial, and personal sanctions and export controls so that Russia realizes that this is unwinnable on the battlefield, unsustainable actually on the battlefield, because of the losses, and also unsustainable because of the damage that's being done to the economy at home.
So that illustrates the criticality of materiel support for the Ukrainians, and we've seen this constant stream of requests from them, understandably. We've seen various responses from the U.S. and our allies, including NATO, yet those responses have been constrained. There's obviously a balance being struck. Is the level of supply we're providing sufficient?
Generally, yes. I would note, by the way, this is where I should give the note that I don't even register to vote. I stopped when I was promoted to 2 stars, and I haven't started again, and so I'm a person without a party. So if I criticize this administration or the previous one, it's not from a political slant. I think that this administration has actually done a very impressive job on galvanizing not just what we can do, but what the rest of NATO and the West can do in all respects. Although, frankly, there are times, and I share this, I know all the people in the administration. I know Jake Sullivan very well, the National Security Advisor, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State. The Secretary of Defense worked for me 3 different times in the war zones as a 3-star and then as a 4-star. And I'm not hesitant to offer thoughts to them. And I do think that there have been a few times where some decisions were taken too slowly. For example, to provide American tanks. There's good reasons why we didn't want to provide the M1 Abrams tank. It's an incredible fuel hog. It's a 1,500 horsepower jet turbine engine, not a diesel. It's very hard to maintain. It's 10 tons heavier than the next tank. It crushes roads, bridges, has to even have its own little separate tank retriever because nothing else can pick it up. So we didn't really want to give it to them, but we were too slow to recognize that the Germans literally are not going to allow the transfer of the Leopard 2 tanks, which they built and control, even if they're in other countries because of end user agreements, unless we give a number of tanks. We finally did that, but it will have delayed this somewhat. There's some other decisions I'd like to see taken. Again, keeping in mind that it's a heck of a lot easier to comment on this, sitting on a stage in Tallahassee than it is to actually be around the Situation Room table where I've been, and there's a little bit more gravity to your actions when you're there. So generally, I think we have done a very, very impressive job. Congress has been very supportive up until now. I mean, the huge amount that was passed last fall, anticipating that it might get tougher once the Republicans took control of the House, I think was a very savvy move, led by Senator McConnell, of course, the Republican leader in the Senate. And the rest of NATO has actually done very impressively as well. Again, we always want to see more, and frankly, as a commander, I never felt like I had enough troops, money, nowadays bandwidth, drones, and all the rest of that. But I think it's been quite impressive. By contrast, I will just add as an aside, having given praise to the administration for this particular episode, which I think is hugely important because it shows the world that we are still the indispensable nation. We will lead the world, and that translates very importantly into deterrence when it comes to China, because your potential adversary not only has to see your capabilities, but also your willingness to employ them. And after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, with which I disagreed, and I did so publicly and the way it was conducted, deterrence had been undermined. President Xi of China seized on that and said, see, you can't count on the Americans as allies and partners, and look at how it went. They're clearly a great power in decline. And I think we've shoved that into the rearview mirror with what we have done here.
Points well taken. Capability and the willingness to deploy it, consistent message,
Yep.
People understand it and they respect it. So on that, Mr. Putin was quoted in yesterday's New York Times as talking about possibly putting nuclear weapons into Belarus as soon as this summer. How do you evaluate that?
No big deal, frankly. I mean, it doesn't matter if they're in Russia or Belarus. I mean, it's just next door. It's just to rattle the nuclear saber. He's getting desperate, is the bottom line. He has been told in no uncertain terms by the U.S. leadership and other NATO leaders that if he were to use nuclear weapons on the battlefield, that Russia would end up worse off rather than better off as a result of that. Jake Sullivan, our national security advisor, said there would be catastrophic consequences, his word. Some others of us, I was on one of the Sunday morning talk shows, they said, what could the range of possibilities be? I said, I think you would see a U.S.-led conventional force response that would destroy everything the Russians have in Ukraine that we can identify and take out clearly and safely without collateral damage, and all the ships on the Black Sea while we're at it. Now, whether or not that actually happened or not, actually, is this off the record, by the way? So yeah, they had a little bit more, but I'll probably leave it there. And more importantly, perhaps than that, is that President Xi now on multiple occasions and Prime Minister Modi of India have both cautioned Putin not even to think about the use of nuclear weapons. So I really don't think it makes any difference whether the weapons are in Russia or in Belarus. He's not going to use them, I don't think, unless there is some moment of incredible desperation, which would be an act of, if you're going down with the ship, perhaps you accelerate the sinking or something like that. But people often say, well, you shouldn't back them into a corner with nothing left to lose. Look, there's always something left to lose. And ultimately, it could be an individual's life. And so I really think it is very unlikely that he would use nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
So the cumulative weight of everything you've described is very encouraging, and it paints an unmistakable picture of this aggression for territorial conquest by force is a massive misadventure. Where are the Russian people on this, and what bearing, if any, does that have on Mr. Putin's ability to continue?
Well, there are two dynamics in Russia that have been significant in resulting in quite substantial support for him. The first is that within the first few weeks, probably 500,000 of the best and brightest of Russia left. For a variety of reasons. They were critics of Putin. They were going to be thrown in jail. If you actually even called it a war instead of a special operation, you could be in jail for 15 years. They made that law. Others just did not want to be in a country anymore that was invading a neighbor and doing it as brutally as Russia has. Keep in mind that the culture within the units in Russia is completely the opposite of ours. We try very hard to observe the Geneva Convention, the law of land warfare. We make mistakes. When we do, we identify them, take corrective measure, and learn from it and move on. Theirs is literally a culture of committing war crimes. It's horrible what they have done in Bucha and these other locations. And of course, that's why Vladimir Putin has been referred to the International Criminal Court for overseeing the conduct of war crimes. So a lot of people left. Then he controls the state media, which is the only media, and they're trying to figure out how to crush the rest of social media and so forth. The vast majority of the folks, probably the age of us in this room, watches TV still. That's where they get their news. He controls it. And it's become the Great Patriotic War. A lot of allusions back to World War II, which is, of course, referred to as the Great Patriotic War. Painting Ukraine as a bunch of Nazis and so forth, how misguided. The Prime Minister of Ukraine is Jewish, for goodness sake. So was his president is, so was his Prime Minister. So again, very incongruous, except that repeated enough times on television, they watch it, and they've, sparked this wave of patriotism. But there is a degree of unrest underneath the surface And that becomes harder and harder and harder as more and more coffins come home. So that's the challenge that he has, I think, over time. And what we have to do, again, is convince him this war is not just unwinnable, it is unsustainable. And then and only then could you have meaningful negotiations. The problem is I can't tell you how long that takes, whether it's the end of this year, if they have a very successful offensive in the Ukrainian side this summer. Is it longer than that? How long can he hold out? And unfortunately, because he is a top 3 producer and exporter of gas, oil, coal, minerals, and agricultural products, and the rest of the world still needs those, and there's plenty of people willing to buy them at a considerable discount, tens of dollars discount, for example, on crude oil alone. He can endure unless we can crank down the sanctions even further, and that's one of the efforts we need to take.
There's a lot in play here all the way around. You correctly summed up some of Russia's assets. Ukraine has assets too. Ukraine produces 16% of the wheat in the world.
The exported wheat of the world, I think it is. Again, it is a staggering amount. And the effect on certain countries, say Egypt and others in North Africa in particular, is very significant. And that's why this wheat agreement that they have reached, they're allowing the Black Sea grain generally to get out now, thankfully.
So, as you famously asked when you were commanding the 101st Airborne at the onset of the Iraq War, how does this war end?
Yeah, tell me how this ends. Boy, did that ever haunt me over the years. I heard that endlessly. You know, what happened is I had an embedded reporter. I knew him really well, Rick Atkinson, 3-time Pulitzer Prize winner. We were the same age. He'd had an appointment to West Point. He actually didn't go. His father was a colonel, but I knew him from the Gulf War years when he was a historian there. And I got overly comfortable with him, frankly. And, you know, he's sitting in the back of your helicopter, your Humvee, whatever, the headquarters, and it was clear to me within the first 10 days that this thing is actually not going to go the way that we've been told it was. You know, the idea that we come in, we topple Saddam and the regime, and everybody else stays in place, and we just hand the country over to a new bunch of folks at the top, and the bureaucrats and police and everything else will be there. So we took down the first city, 500,000 people during the fight to Baghdad. And I remember calling my boss afterwards, and I said, hey, boss, I got good news and bad news. Good news is we own Najaf, the holiest city in Shia Islam. The bad news is we own Najaf. What do you want us to do with it? You know, all the government left. They've gone. They've fled. We own it. So he said, why don't you call that organization down in Kuwait that told you what I asked actually before the invasion. I said, could you give me a little more detail on what happens when we get to Baghdad and topple the regime? And this retired 3-star stood up. He said, Dave, you just get us to Baghdad. We'll take it from there. So I called them up, and there was nothing coming. So anyway, we started to own it. So it was clear to me this wasn't going to turn out the way it had been said. And that's when I turned to him and I said, tell me how this ends. The problem was I was on the record. It became the title of a book. I mean, I had to live with that. We did eventually determine how Iraq would end, at least for a period of time, thanks to the surge in Iraq when our soldiers did such magnificent work to pull the country out of a civil war, drive violence down by 90%, and keep it down for 3.5 years until we left and the prime minister unraveled it tragically. In the case of Ukraine, I think this ends one of a couple of ways. Ideally, Putin is convinced that it's unsustainable, and he does actually sit down and negotiate a withdrawal of some type. Ukraine, even though they want whole and free as their objective, nonetheless, to get the war to stop, the loss of life, the civilian damage, the damage to their infrastructure that's being done every single night by Russian missiles and Iranian drones, and with the promise of hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild the country, a Marshall-like plan, and an ironclad security guarantee, that could look pretty attractive to them. And you might actually get some kind of negotiated resolution. Otherwise, it's possible that Ukraine achieves what it can on the battlefield, it's adequate, and then they get a frozen conflict, as they say, as it was before, but with different front lines, yet it's sufficiently enduring, and we provide a security guarantee and lots of support so that they can actually rebuild and even perhaps attract outside investment. Again, without a security guarantee, obviously outside investment won't be forthcoming. And the hundreds of billions of dollars needed for the reconstruction will just get it back to where it was, not propel it to the next level. So I think those are among the ways. I don't see a Russian victory, and I don't know at this vantage point that I see a complete Ukrainian victory either, as they would define it, which is to retake all of their country, including the Crimean Peninsula, which is a challenging military problem given the terrain and the canal and mountains and a variety of other things and a lack of amphibious capabilities. And then that portion of southeastern part of the country that the separatists have controlled since 2014.
Are there obvious winners and losers among other global powers, China, India, even Brazil, in the wake of this whole situation?
Yeah, there have been, and that is ongoing. Obviously, those who export oil, export natural gas, including the United States. Keep in mind, thanks to our ingenuity, deep directional drilling, hydraulic fracturing, seismic big data, our agile capital markets, our legal structure where you own the mineral rights underneath your land. We had the energy revolution here, not anywhere else, even though that other places have vast deposits of natural gas and oil in their shale rock. We're the biggest crude oil producer in the entire world as a result of that, and we're also the biggest natural gas producer in the entire world. And there have been, this is why oil companies have had record profits. And again, that's true around the world. There's a variety of others. We could walk our way around. Anything that has been restricted from Russia obviously has helped. If you're building liquefaction plant or gasification plants in Germany, this is a boom season for that. Germany didn't have a single gasification plant. In other words, you liquefy natural gas in a liquefaction plant, you transport it in an LNG container, and then at the destination, it's regasified, put into a pipeline as natural gas again. Germany already has one of those. I think there's 2 more at least that will be finished this year, and then several more after that. They've done a remarkable job of transitioning from Russian pipeline gas, on which are very, very heavily dependent, to, again, doing away with that and also reducing dependence in other ways as well. So, yeah, look, and to be candid, the geopolitical risk work that we do in the KKR Global Institute is not just to identify all the reasons why you can't do an investment, hopefully mitigate as many as you can. It's also to identify opportunities in other areas. And there's a host of these associated with a lot of different developments in recent years, including those during COVID. I mean, the challenges in the supply chain world have been dramatic. We also identified, a huge theme is don't do all of the manufacturing and assembly of your product in one part of one country, especially if they're going to shut it down with a zero COVID policy, as happened to Apple. Where is Apple building its new manufacturing and assembly plant? India. So India is a big winner out of this. It's also a winner because labor costs in China are going up. It's a winner because of concerns about dual-use technology that China could use in its military services. It's a winner because it has 1.4 billion people. It's now bigger than China. The demographics are good rather than demographic death spiral, as we see in China entering. Japan's already in it, but dealing with it much better. One of the big questions has always been, can China get rich before it gets old, which is what Japan did, or does it get old before it gets rich? And actually the answer is not completely clear right now. We'll see how this plays out and how well President Xi, who now has absolute control in the way that no leader has in China since Mao, and of course he's on his 3rd term as the party leader and therefore also the president and head of the military commission. Can he guide the country, again, through the middle income trap to continue to grow, or does there appear a degree of stagnation because of the state reasserting itself in politics, in economics, and also in foreign policy?
You are one of the great leaders of the world. You're also quite literally a scholar on the subject of leadership, strategy, tactics, etc. When you look at Zelensky and Putin, how do you contrast these people other than one being an obvious force for good and the other an obvious force for evil?
Great question. Yep. So let me give you an intellectual construct for strategic leadership, Now, all leaders actually perform the 4 tasks that I'm going to describe, but strategic leaders, those at the very top of a country, an organization, business, military unit, they have to get the first task uniquely right, because they're the ones that have to do that. So in this construct, we actually distilled and captured in a website at Harvard's Belfer Center. I was a fellow there for 6 years as well, and had turned out a whole bunch of former Iraq and Afghan veterans who said, we want to work with you to capture all of this. So the 4 tasks of a strategic leader, and then we can measure Putin against them, as well as Zelensky, are: number 1, get the big ideas right, get the strategy right, the assessments right, and all the rest of that. Number 2 is communicate the big ideas effectively through the breadth and depth of an organization, a country, whatever, to all the stakeholders. Number 3, oversee the implementation of the big ideas. That's what we normally think of as leadership. That's energy, it's example, it's incentivization, it's hiring the great people and developing them, it's allowing those not measuring up to move on sooner than they thought. It's how you spend your time, sharing risk and hardship. It's all of this, the metrics that you use to determine if you're winning or losing. And then a 4th step that's often overlooked, which is to sit down formally in a variety of different fora and meetings, if you will, action-forcing mechanisms to determine how you need to refine the big ideas so that you can do it again and again and again. And to put this into terms that are easy to understand, I always loved how Reed Hastings, who's a great strategic leader, he just stepped down actually from Netflix, but he helped reinvent Netflix 4 times if you count the beginning, maybe even more if you count going international. First was, we're going to put movies in the hands of customers without brick and mortar. So we're going to undercut Blockbuster. That's the big idea. Communicates it, oversees it, gets down here 2 years later, says, how are we doing? Well, we're doing great. Blockbuster's going out of business. As you may know, there's only one left. I think it's in Big Bend, Oregon, which is a famously contrarian place, refused to let its Blockbuster die, and now has become a major tourist attraction for all people who are feeling nostalgic about Blockbuster. They all go there and rent movies. So the next incarnation is broadband speeds are fast enough, so his new big idea is let's allow people to download movies. They work through that. The third one is, of course, they invest, we're going to make our own content, $100 million on House of Cards alone, a bunch of others that we all revisited during the pandemic and got familiar with again. And then the fourth one was, we're going to make major motion pictures. And he goes out and buys 2 major movie studios and wins more Academy Awards 3 years ago, I think, than any other major motion picture studio. Although there I did have to part with him, and I've talked to him about this, because I've laid this out, and he actually has a model that's very similar to this, slightly different terminology, but very similar. But I said, Brad Pitt playing General Stan McChrystal, my very close friend, he was working for me in Afghanistan, then I replaced him. He worked for many years in the Counterterrorist Joint Special Operations Command in the war years. Very close friend. I said, he's not a little toy soldier like Brad Pitt played. Marching around like a wooden soldier and all the rest of this stuff. And I said, besides that, how could Brad Pitt not play me? Anyway, but other than that, Reed Hastings was flawless. But you get the idea. Now let's go to Putin and to Zelensky. Putin literally has gotten just about all the big ideas wrong. Completely underestimated the Ukrainians, overestimated the Russians. Mistake after mistake after mistake. The campaign design was terrible. The leadership has been abysmal. The mobilization has been tepid. Everything about he has done poorly. And he's also not been very effective communicating, if you think, to the rest of the world. He's done fine with the Russian population that only watches state TV, but for all the rest of us, we're less than convinced about the validity of his grievance-filled, revisionist, revanchist world view. Zelensky, on the other hand, positively brilliant, from day one. I don't want to ride, I want ammunition. Addressing every single Congress, Parliament, Bundestag, often in their own language, with their own words, allusions to their history that are very meaningful. The example has been extraordinary. He was just once again in Bakhmut, which is very much under siege, and there he is walking around with the soldiers, putting decorations on them, sharing risk and hardship, which is what leaders do in combat. He's communicated, again, brilliantly. He's overseen this. He decided early on he's not leaving Kyiv, even when it was under siege. His family hasn't left Kyiv. And then they do sit down periodically and they determine how to refine the big ideas and do it again and again and again. So the contrast when it comes to evaluating strategic leadership could not be more clear, frankly, than the good versus evil that this is as well. I mean, this is about as cut and dried, I think, as a situation can be. Literally, a kleptocratic, dictatorial, murderous leader on one hand, invading a neighboring country without provocation and in a brutal manner. And then the other country, a democracy, however flawed, to be sure, free market economy, again, trying to withstand and again, fighting for its very independence.
That sums it up about as artfully as you possibly could, and also provides that recipe for leadership that's so important in this and all things in life's endeavor. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. It's a privilege.
Last question. And you touched on earlier that there might be a faction in Congress that might seek to be less supportive of the effort in Ukraine. There's history of that in every major conflict this country's ever been in. Given the starkness of the good and evil that you just outlined, my gut is that the American people are on the right side of this, and that extends to elected officials, and we stay in the right direction here. Would that be your take?
Yeah, I think that's generally true. Obviously, again, there are certain elements of one party in the House in particular, although interestingly, that party in the Senate is as staunch as it could possibly be. But I don't think that prevents bipartisan support for this effort going forward. I mean, I wouldn't want to be the party that undermined, again, support for a democracy that has been invaded by a kleptocracy. It seems, again, fairly clear.
Would agree. It has been an utter honor and privilege to be
Honor is
with you.
mine. Thank you very much. You bet. Thanks.
You've been listening to General David Petraeus, partner at the investment firm of KKR and chairman of the KKR Global Institute, speaking before the Economic Club of Florida on March 27, 2023 in Tallahassee, Florida. For more information on KKR, visit kkr.com. The Economic Club of Florida promotes interest and enlightenment on important economic, political, and social issues of the day. To learn more, including how to become a member, visit our website at economic-club.com. This program was recorded at the Champions Club at Florida State University in Tallahassee, Florida.